you don't have to look far to see that this world is broken. You don't have to look far at all to see that this world is broken, that pain and problems are pervasive. In fact, they're inescapable. We all deal with a measure of frustration, disappointment, anxiety, fear, insecurity, stress, sadness. Those things mark our daily lives to one degree or another. We have suffered, or we will suffer at some point, the difficulty of relational strain, of hard relationships, of loneliness, a nagging sense of not being enough, feeling misunderstood, being rejected. All of us have experienced some of those things to some degree. You probably haven't lost everything like Job, but you know what it feels like to lose. I know what it feels like to lose. Thankfully, I haven't lost everything the way Job lost everything in one clean swoop, but I know what it feels like to lose, and you know what it feels like to lose. Maybe you know what it feels like to lose a relationship or to lose trust in someone you depended on. Maybe you know what it's like to lose a parent or a child or a spouse, a marriage. Maybe you know what it feels like to lose hope, to lose confidence, to lose a sense of purpose or direction in life. Maybe you know what it feels like to lose your health. Maybe you know what it feels like to lose your faith. You have fond memories of when you once believed, but because of what life has thrown you, you find it really difficult to believe in God anymore. Maybe you feel lost in that sense. Maybe you just know what it feels like to get lost altogether. Maybe you're lost now. Well, the story of Job, as we've seen over the last 9 weeks, is about those intersections in life where our losses and God's love collide, where they meet, where they crash into each other. It's about the fact that while life is full of losses, we will never lose God because God will never lose us. That's a big statement. It's one the Bible makes over and over and over again. That God doesn't lose us. While it may feel like we've lost God, we know that God doesn't lose us. In fact, when we wander off, He joyfully and persistently comes after us. God doesn't lose what God loves. And yet, if we're honest, we have to admit that sometimes it sure feels like God has lost us. I've been through those seasons in life where it certainly feels like God has lost me, or God has let me go and refused to come after me. That has been my feeling from time to time. Job certainly felt that way. He felt like God had lost him. I've said for the last few weeks that it's interesting to note that Job never laments the fact that he lost his stuff. He never says, I want my stuff back. What he laments is this sense that he's lost God. He wants God back. That's what he's lamenting. That's what's causing him the deepest pain. That's what's causing him the deepest grief, is because he feels like God has lost him, that he's lost God, God has lost him, God has abandoned him, God has left him. Job felt that way. He couldn't understand what was happening to him and why it was happening, and so he demanded an explanation. He wanted to know why. Why is this happening? Well, his friends came along and tried to give their own explanation to Job as to why he was suffering so much, and he knew his friends were wrong about God, and so he insisted on a right answer from God himself. He goes directly to the source. And for 6 chapters, Job gives his opinions on God. He expresses frustration with God and how God does things. He accuses God of injustice. He confronts God, he questions God, he badgers God for answers, he challenges God to explain himself. You owe me an explanation. Why is this happening? Why am I experiencing what I'm experiencing and suffering what I'm suffering? And God doesn't say anything. For a long time, he stays silent. I find that both irritating to a certain degree. Has God not felt silent to you at different times, and you feel like you're going to him, you're grieving to him, you're lamenting to him, you're expressing frustration to him, and nothing seems to be coming back? He seems silent. And so on the one hand, he's sort of annoyingly silent. during this time. But at the same time, it's a demonstration of God's mercy because he's letting Job vent. He lets him grieve out loud. He's letting Job grieve. He's letting Job question. He's not shutting Job down right away. He's letting Job express himself. And we've said week in and week out that one demonstration of God's mercy, one demonstration of God's grace is that he gives us the space to express the way we feel. He gives us the room and the space. He gives us the permission to express frustration, anger, confusion, all of those things. And so this is what we see. We see Job for 6 chapters, I think 6 chapters, yes, for 6 chapters, going on and on and on, confronting God, challenging God, questioning God, badgering God for answers as to why he's suffering, and God remains silent until he finally speaks in chapter 38, which we looked at 2 weeks ago. And I love the way that chapter begins. It says, out of the whirlwind, God finally speaks. And I mentioned that life in trouble feels like a whirlwind. When we're suffering and we're feeling like life is inside out and upside down, like we're living our lives in a washing machine, it feels like a whirlwind. And it says that God speaks to him from the whirlwind, not on the other side of it, not outside of it, but in it, from it. And I love his first question to Job. He says, Job, for a long time now, 6 chapters to be exact, you have been questioning me. Now brace yourself like a man because I'm about to question you. And for 4 chapters, God just asks Job question after question after question. And he begins by asking Job, where were you when I was laying the earth's foundations? You're questioning who I am and what I've done and how I do things. So let me ask you a few questions. Where were you when I was telling the lightning where to strike and the thunder where to roll? Where were you when I was creating sea creatures that no human eye will ever see? I simply created them so that I could see them. Where were you when I was the midwife to the goats in the hills? Where were you? Are you able to tell the stars where to go and how to shine? Are you able to tell the sun when to rise and when to set? And after God just sort of flexes his muscles and shows Job who he is, we get to chapter 42. And Job finally responds to this grand, magnificent display of who God is and what God is capable of doing, God's power, God's might, God's size. And Job responds to that. And it's funny because for 4 chapters, actually 3, 38, 39, 40, 41, 4 chapters, 4 chapters, I was never good at math or science, by the way. But for 4 chapters, God asks Job a series of questions that helps Job see how small he actually is. And ironically, by learning of his smallness, and we'll get back to this in a minute, by learning of his smallness, he's set free. He is set free by humiliation. You could put it that way, provocatively. I love the way the Message, that translation, that paraphrase of the Bible that Eugene Peterson put together, which I highly recommend. I have fallen more deeply in love with it as I've gotten older because the language is simple and it's beautiful. But I love the way the Message translates Job's response in chapter 42. This is what it says. Job answered God. After God says everything that God says and asks Job all the questions that he asks Job, Job finally responds, and it says, Job answered God. And this is what he said. I'm convinced you can do anything. You can do everything. Nothing and no one can upset your plans. You asked me, who is this muddying the water, ignorantly confusing the issue, second-guessing my purposes? I admit, I was the one doing that. I babbled on about things far beyond me. I made small talk about wonders way over my head. You told me, God, listen and let me do the talking. Let me ask the questions and you give the answers. I admit that I once lived by rumors of you. Now I have it all firsthand from my own eyes and ears. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. It's one of my favorite verses in the Bible. On the heels of catastrophe, This tells you something beautiful about God and about how God harnesses pain and brokenness and suffering in our lives and in this world. He brings good things out of big messes. And I love the fact that Job says, before my ears had heard of you, I knew about you, I talked about you, I heard stories about you, I taught my children about you, but it wasn't until I lost big that I see you, that I've seen you in ways that I could have never seen you before. The road from, I mentioned this just a minute ago, that the road from knowing about God to knowing God, from hearing to seeing, is paved in suffering and loss. There's just simply no other way to be truly set free from our innate sense of self-sufficiency. I've said this before, but real slavery is self-reliance. If you want to know what real bona fide slavery is, the way the Bible describes it and defines it, real slavery is self-reliance. When you believe that everything depends on you, okay, when everything is riding on your shoulders, if your life's going to turn out the way you want it to turn out, it's entirely up to you. If your kids are going to turn out the way you want them to turn out, it's entirely up to you. If your marriage is going to be everything you hope it to be, it's entirely up to you. The whole world is riding on your shoulders. All of the outcomes are in your hands. Well, that may sound empowering at first, but you and I both know how exhausting that is. Exhausting. Because when you believe that everything depends on you, you're enslaved to your own strengths and weaknesses, your own abilities. You're at the mercy of your own limitations when you believe that. We are all high anthropologists by nature. Okay, isn't that fancy? Aren't you impressed? Let me explain what that means, because we talk about that around here. We talk about the difference between high anthropology and low anthropology. We are all by nature high anthropologists, and this is what that means. That's just a fun and fancy way, an impressive way, I might add, of saying that we tend to believe that we're better than we are. We tend to believe that we're stronger than we are. We tend to believe that we're more capable than we are. And there is no shortage of affirmations outside of us telling us those things. You can accomplish anything. If you just set your mind to it and you focus, you can do anything. We feel more valuable if we believe that we can accomplish anything, that we can make it through anything, that we can fix anything if we just try hard enough and apply ourselves. I looked up some quotes about this last night. There is no shortage of quotes. I think that I Googled something like, you can accomplish anything, ... And it pulled up pages and pages of fill in the blanks. And my favorite was this: you can do anything, you can accomplish anything, don't ever forget that. I'm thinking about all of the things that I have tried so hard to accomplish and haven't been able to. I would love to be able to fly home from here rather than drive home from here. I can't do it. There are just so many things that, if we're honest, we have to admit we can't do. We've tried, we can't do it. Samuel was asking me this morning if I ever played football, because I love football. And I said, I played through 7th grade. And then I stopped. And he said, why did you stop? And I said, because I basically stopped growing at that point. And as much I had the mind and the passion to be the quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys, but not the body. No matter how much I focused or how hard I tried, I wasn't going to accomplish my dream of being an NFL quarterback. And we could say that about a lot of things that we tend to think we're stronger than we are, bigger than we are, more capable than we are. But this overinflated view of ourselves, this high anthropology, okay, sort of a high view of mankind, a high view of humanity. We're big, we're strong, we can accomplish anything. This overinflated view of ourselves is actually enslaving. Like I said a minute ago, it feels empowering at first, it feels motivating at first. But at the end of the day, it's enslaving, because what happens when we fail at the same thing over and over and over again? We've applied ourselves. We've set our minds to do it. We've focused. We've really tried. We just can't seem to do it. What happens when we can't overcome the addiction for more than a week? When no matter how hard we try, we can't beat our anger problem. When no matter how hard we try, we can't seem to tame our tongue or get past our anxiety or escape our fears. We know what that feels like. What happens when no amount of positive thinking can scale the wall of guilt and shame you feel? I mean, have you ever tried to strong arm yourself out of sadness? Have you ever tried to talk yourself out of insecurities? Have you ever tried to will yourself out of loneliness or muscle your way out of feeling rejected? I mean, when you start thinking about it like that, you realize how silly it is to believe the nonsense that we can accomplish anything, that we're big and we're strong and we're capable and we can accomplish anything if we just set our minds to it, if we just focus, apply ourselves, and try. See, the only thing that can set us free from the bondage of relying on ourselves is coming face to face with our own deficiencies. That's why crashing and burning in life is never fun, but it can usher in a freedom like you've never experienced before. Because when you come face to face with your own deficiencies, your own weaknesses, your own limitations, and you finally come to the realization that you can't make it on your own, that's when God's grace shows up in such brand new, bright, and liberating ways and reminds you of who He is. And when you are reminded of who He is, you see yourself for who you are. See, this is what happened to Job. He came face to face with his own smallness, his own limitations in knowledge and power. God asks him all of these questions to expose the fact that Job is very limited, much more limited than he thinks he is when it comes to what he knows and what he can do. That Job is not all-knowing, he's not all-powerful. By revealing himself to Job, Job comes face to face with his own deficiencies. When God showed Job who God was, Job also discovered who he was. His self-awareness went through the roof. He probably never saw himself more honestly and more truthfully than he did at that moment, when he could evaluate himself and measure himself against who God is. Well, Job was now freshly acquainted with his creatureliness, his humanness, his smallness, his dependence on God. He went from being a high anthropologist to a low anthropologist. Okay, like what? Having a low anthropology, okay, let me just put it as simply and plainly as I can, and this is actually really important, okay? It may sound somewhat academic, but it's actually very important. Having a low anthropology simply means having an honest view of yourself and others that admits we all need help from one another and ultimately from God. It maintains, having a low anthropology maintains that we're not the good, strong, independent people we like to think we are. It looks at humanity realistically rather than idealistically. And what it sees is that none of us is sin-free. We are all imperfect people with a host of limitations. All of us are. Suffering produces low anthropologists because suffering reminds us how small we are and how much we need God. That's a beautiful thing. In fact, once we realize this, something beautiful actually happens. There is tremendous freedom in understanding and embracing our smallness, our limitations, our human deficiencies. There's great liberation in that. There's great freedom in that. Because qualities are born inside of us that would otherwise be absent. Okay, so when we realize suffering produces low anthropologists because suffering reminds us how small we are and how much we need God. And when that realization sets in, this beautiful thing happens. These qualities are born inside of us that would otherwise be absent. Things like empathy, humility, wisdom, emotional intelligence, insight, compassion, a deep sense of feeling, a deeper love. None of those things are developed apart from pain and loss. None of those things. The Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky said that pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart. Always. It's a great quote. Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart. See, I can speak for myself, but I'm sure I can speak for you too in saying that we want to be around people. Don't you want to be around people who are patient, people who are humble, people who are compassionate and empathetic, people who listen, people who care, people who understand, people who love you? We want to be around those kinds of people. Those are attractive qualities. Those are the kind of qualities that we want to be around. We love that stuff. We admire people who possess those traits. Well, the flip side of that is the kinds of people we want to desperately get away from. The people who are unattractive to us. People who are self-centered, arrogant, always talking about themselves, impatient, judgmental. Those are the kinds of people we don't want to be around. Those are like Job's friends. They were high anthropologists. They had a lofty view of themselves and what they could accomplish and what they thought Job could accomplish if he just faced up to what he had done and focused on how to fix himself and how to fix the situation. Well, it begs the question, okay, well, what is it that produces something like judgmentalism? Okay, we all hate it. We don't like to be around judgmental people, critical people, people who feel a sense of superiority to us, moral or otherwise. We don't like to be around those people. Those are unattractive qualities. We typically want to get away from those people. Well, it begs the question, what produces that kind of stuff that we want to get away from? What produces judgmentalism, for instance? Well, it comes from thinking that you're strong. It comes from believing that you're better than other people. Failure and suffering and pain and loss tend to remind us that we're just as vulnerable as anyone else, that we're not strong and self-sufficient. That's why suffering, pain, loss, failure, as much as it ushers discomfort into our lives, in the end, it is not our enemy. Because while suffering and loss and pain and failure in and of itself is not good, God does bring great good out of those things. Great good out of those things. The premier good thing he brings out of it is we go from hearing to seeing. We go from knowing about God to knowing God. Because, people who have failed, people who know their weaknesses, they tend to be people of humility and empathy and understanding and wisdom. Pain and loss has a way of softening our hard edges. It just does. I like to think about my life in two parts. It's made up of many more than two parts, but I like to think about my life. It's easier to think about my life in two parts. Everything leading up to 2015 and everything after 2015. Stacy refers to my years leading up to 2015, the BS years, the before Stacy years. And I like to, I had a full, beautiful, in so many ways, wonderful life up until then. And I believed everything I believe now. I believed in the radicality of God's unconditional love and his grace, the amazing nature of his mercy. I wrote about it. I preached about it. I talked about it. I counseled people in light of those things. I believed it. I really believed it. And then I collapsed, crashed, burned. And it took me some time. Obviously, it's taken me some time, some distance to gain some perspective and to look back at the man that I was in comparison to the man that I am now. And I'm no less sinful now than I was then. That's not the change. The change is I'm softer. I'm a little bit more patient with people. I think I've always been relatively sympathetic to people who are suffering. I've always been relatively sympathetic to sinners. But there's a difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is, I hear what you're saying. Empathy is, I feel what you're feeling because I've been there. And there's an empathy that I have for people now that I just didn't have before, not because I didn't want it, but because there's no way to get that kind of stuff apart from crashing and burning, failure, loss, something, pain, suffering, whatever the case may be. It doesn't have to look like my circumstances. We all have our own circumstances of sort of coming face to face with our own limitations, coming face to face with our own smallness and the kind of humility that produces. And I don't know, I find myself these days not wanting to get out of conversations as quickly. When I'm talking to somebody, for instance, I'm really listening. It took me nearly 50 years and a lot of losing to get to the point where I actually care. Not that I didn't care before, but I care way more now. I listen more now. There are those that would say that given my past, that I have disqualified myself for life from ever standing behind a pulpit and telling people about God. And I'm not arguing for or against that point. All I can say is this, and this I know to be true, that I am much more pastoral now than I ever was before. And the reason for that is because I've lost, I've suffered, and my suffering for the most part was self-induced. I wasn't suffering at the hands of someone else. I wasn't a victim. I was a perpetrator. I was suffering at my own hands. And I caused a lot of other people to suffer because of my irresponsibility and my selfishness. And it's sort of coming face to face. I tell people all the time, people would come to hear me speak and they would read my books and all of those things because they were like, man, this guy gets me, He's like one of us. He talks about his sin and his struggle pretty openly. That really hasn't changed that much. And I say, therefore, when I bottomed out, I shouldn't have been as surprised as I was. I mean, I knew I was bad. I just didn't know I was that bad. And it was taking certain circumstances in my life to reveal to me just how weak and needy and in essence, bad I was to realize how good God is. I mean, I don't know of a more effective way to show you guys how good God is unless I tell you a little bit about my own badness. There's just no better way for me to convince you of God's strength unless I tell you a little bit about my own weaknesses. I mean, it is God's strength that shows itself, as Paul says in Corinthians, in and through our weaknesses. Some of us are in a season of suffering, we're in a season of losing, we're in a season of failure, we're experiencing despair and depression and discouragement in ways perhaps that we never have before. And we're begging God to relieve us. I can remember waking up every day for years following 2015, asking God for some reprieve, some relief, bring back some sense of normalcy to my life. I feel like a fish out of water. Everything seems and feels unfamiliar. I don't know who I am anymore. And at the time, I was in my early 40s. And when you're undergoing an identity crisis in your early 40s, it's very uncomfortable. A year before, I knew exactly who I was every time I walked in a room. And now I found myself in my early mid-40s going, I don't know who I am anymore. I don't even want to leave the house. I've always wanted to be around people. I've always loved being around people, and now I didn't want to be around anybody. I was scared, insecure in a way that I had never felt before. Very, very, very uncomfortable. And I can remember begging God for reprieve. Help me. Bring relief. Bring relief. And he just seemingly and annoyingly let it ride for a long time, much longer than I wanted him to. And I would bring to mind Paul, the Apostle Paul, begging God to remove the thorn in his flesh. 3 times he says, God, please take this thorn out of my flesh. Remove this discomfort from me. Whatever it was, there's been a lot of speculation as to what that thorn was. Some people say it was Paul's eyesight. Some people say it was an annoying person in his life. Some people say it was lust or greed or pride or whatever. I think the Bible intentionally doesn't tell us what it is so that we can all relate to him when he says that. And God says, I'm not going to take it because your greatest enemy is a sense of self-sufficiency. That's your greatest enemy. Your downfall, Paul, will be for you to think that you can do this without me. And by allowing this thorn to remain in your side, it is a help to you because it's a constant reminder that you are dependent on me, and that's where real freedom is. I can remember asking God the same thing, bring relief, bring reprieve. And God just seemingly let it drag on and on. I remember cussing at him, cussing. You ever cuss at God? Cuss to God in your prayers? Maybe you haven't. I have and do from time to time. But I just remember going, the punishment doesn't fit the crime. I know plenty of people who have done a lot worse, and they're not suffering the way I'm suffering. What's the matter with you? I gave my life to serving you, to telling people about you. This is the way you treat your friends? I remember saying those things to God in exasperation, frustration, confusion, anger. And I didn't know at the time that God was producing things in me that would liberate me in ways that I had never known before. That he was finally making me a people person. He was teaching me about what love actually is. Not just love for him, but love for others. What does it really mean to care about people, to love people, to be patient with people, to be gracious with people? When people screw up over and over and over, and they hurt you over and over and over, what does it look like to be gracious? Man, the people who I know who are the most gracious are the people who know how desperately they need God's grace themselves. The people who tend to be the most patient are the people who are keenly aware of how patient God is with them. The people who tend to be the most forgiving are the people who understand at a deep level just how much God has forgiven them. Well, all of that stuff happens in pain, loss, suffering, failure, whatever you want to call it. That's when we go from not only simply hearing about God to seeing God, but in a very real way, we see ourselves afresh. And in seeing God and ourselves afresh, we see everyone else afresh. I can remember, I think I've shared this before, it's embarrassing to admit, and this wasn't always the case, but I can certainly remember occasions where I would be talking to people and kind of, okay, in my head, thinking, okay, just let's get on with that. I wasn't even really listening, to be honest with you. And I was kind of, metaphorically looking over their shoulders to see if there was a better conversation I could become a part of quickly. And I recognized about a year ago, out of the blue, that I don't do that anymore. Not because I've been trying not to do it. It's not like I've said to myself, you know what? I'm going to make myself a to-do list, a self-improvement to-do list. And I used to be the kind of guy who wouldn't listen real carefully and closely and lovingly to people. And now I'm going to become that guy. So I'm going to put certain things in place so I become that guy. That's not the way it went down. I just sort of woke up one day and realized God's kind of made me that guy. And I haven't done anything to contribute to that process other than resist it from time to time. God's done it. And it's because you lose, you fail. You come face to face with your own deficiencies, your own limitations, your own weaknesses. And you start realizing how much grace you need, how much help you need. That changes things. God does great things. And so I said, while pain and loss and failure and suffering is not good in itself, God does bring great good out of pain and loss and suffering and failure. Which is why I've said over the course of this series that what we need most is not the absence of suffering. Okay, we tend to think that what we need most in our lives is the absence of trials, the absence of suffering, the absence of trouble, the absence of pain. That's not what we need most. What we need most is the presence of God. That's what we need. We need God doing his God things in the cracks of our life. That's what we need. That's where freedom is found. God's office of grace is at the end of our rope. That's where it is. It's where he meets us. Grace is it's like water. It flows to the lowest part. And when we find ourselves at our lowest, we experience and discover God's tenderness and his care and his size and his strength and his grace and his mercy and his love in ways that we can't see otherwise. So what we need most is the presence of God, because God is always working behind the scenes and in the rubble of our lives, always in the wreckage of our lives, even when we can't see it, even when we can't feel it, especially when we can't see it and when we can't feel it. He's always present. He's always loving us through our pains, and he's always providing us with everything we need, whether we can see it or not. Everything he's doing in our lives, he's doing to set us free from ourselves. Everything. I had heard of you, but now I see you, Job said. Mark that verse down. Mark it down. Underline it. If you are old-fashioned like me and still carry around books, underline it. Make notes in the column. Remind yourself. Put a date next to the verse. This date, because you'll need it at some point. You'll need it. You'll be in a crucible of ache. You'll be in a season of loss and suffering, and you'll ask yourself, where is God? And what's he doing? And more importantly, why is he allowing this to happen to me right now? And what you need to remember in those moments is that God is moving you from hearing to seeing, from simply knowing about him to knowing him in a way that's going to set you free far beyond your wildest imagination. And there's never been a better place in all of human history to see who God is and to see what kind of God God actually is than at the cross. I mean, there's just no better place to look. This time of year, we could say, well, you can also find that in the manger. Yes, absolutely true. God becoming man, taking on human flesh and frailties, coming into this messy world, not because we were asking him to, but because we needed him to, and we resisted his approach, as we often do still today. And so you can certainly see who God is, the kind of God that God is in the manger and the incarnation, but you see him supremely at the cross. Loving his enemies, dying for those who are killing him, forgiving those who are making fun of him, asking his Father in heaven to forgive these people, these Roman soldiers who are mocking him and playing games to see who can win his garments, and saying, God, Father, forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. I mean, what kind of God is that? What kind of God loves us at our worst? What kind of God demonstrates and exercises patience in the face of that kind of ridicule and trial? Well, that's the same God that showed himself to Job. I'm big. I can handle this. I'm with you. I've never left. I love you.